Please welcome another first-time DynamicsCon speaker and Microsoft MVP, Nathan Rose. Today, he'll be presenting his session, PowerFx, Everything, Everywhere, and All at Once. Please stick around after Nathan's session for a live Q&A.
Kia ora, everyone. I'm Nathan Rose. I'm a solution architect and Microsoft MVP at Olympic 33, based here in beautiful Auckland, New Zealand. I am incredibly excited to be part of this event, DynamicsCon Virtual. A huge shout out to the organizers at DynamicsCon. Thank you so much for having me. I am thoroughly looking forward to our time together today. Welcome to PowerFx, Everything, Everywhere, and All at Once, where we're going to explore the incredible growth of PowerFx across the Power Platform across the past few years. I am really excited to have this opportunity to share my love of PowerFx with you. So let's dive in. I don't know about you, but this expression, the greatest thing since sliced bread, has always seemed kind of comical to me. As long as I've known, bread's always been sliced. That's the only way it's ever come from the supermarket. And so whenever we say something is the greatest thing since sliced bread, I've always thought that we're being comical, ironic, perhaps a little sarcastic. But it might surprise you to know that sliced bread is less than 100 years old. That's right. In the year 1930, the Wonder Bread Corporation acquired the patents for pre-sliced bread and started marketing it in the United States. And then something shocking happened. Within 3 years, by 1933, pre-sliced bread accounted for 80% of all of the bread sales in the United States. Think about that for a minute. In 1930, there was no pre-sliced bread. And 3 years later, 4 out of every 5 loaves of bread sold in the US came pre-sliced. That's an incredible growth trajectory. And so I want you to keep this thought in mind as we're going through our time together today. Why do some innovations sweep the world so fast, often without us noticing at all? Kia ora, everyone. I'm Nathan Rose, and PowerFx is my love language. By the end of our time together, it'll be your love language too, as I describe how incredibly powerful and special it is. I'm a solution architect at Olympic 33 here in beautiful Auckland, New Zealand. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in business applications. And I've kind of become the PowerFx guy over the last few years as I've tracked its growth and explored its incredible capabilities. My mission is to unleash human creativity via the Power Platform and low code, particularly with tools like PowerFx. Now, a quick overview of our journey together today. We're going to start out by looking at what PowerFx is and why it's so incredibly necessary at this specific point in our human history. We'll then explore how PowerFx has forever altered the software development landscape before getting hands-on with it and seeing PowerFx across the Power Platform. You'll see it in Power Apps, Dataverse, Copilot Studio, and Power Pages to get a really good idea of what it can do. And then we'll wrap up with what this means for you and some Q&A. My favorite part of these sessions is the Q&A at the end. I love the questions that you ask. I get my best inspiration and ideas from what you ask, and so I can't wait to get into that part at the end of our time together. And just like our astronaut here, perhaps if they'd used PowerFx for HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey, things might have turned out quite differently. But let's dive in. What is PowerFx? PowerFx is Microsoft's low-code formula-based love language to customize the Power Platform. You heard that right. I said love language because I absolutely love it, and I'm convinced that you will too. PowerFx has a number of characteristics that make it unique. To start with, it's open source. It's comprised of human-friendly commands that can be used by everyone from makers to professional devs. It's strong-typed and declarative. If you're not familiar with those terms, don't worry, I'll explain them shortly. It's always live, it works just like Excel, and it's one language to rule them all. But before we explore these characteristics that make PowerFx so unique, we have a problem. There's an elephant in the room we need to discuss. As our friend Bill Shakespeare once said, now is the winter of our application shortage. The worldwide shortage of software developers is tipped to reach 85 million by the year 2030. That's just 6 years from now. Incidentally, it's also when sliced bread turns 100. Now, the shortage of software developers means job security and good wages for people like you and me. However, it has some unintended side effects that aren't so great. To start with, the shortage of software developers lengthens development cycles, reduces quality, raises costs, stifles innovation. Basically, it's holding us back as companies, as communities, as countries, as citizens of planet Earth, because we can't create all the software we need. We can't be as productive or as innovative as we possibly could because we don't have enough people to create the software to empower us to get to where we could be. Now, they say that history doesn't repeat itself, but that it often rhymes. And the shortage of software developers reminds me of someone you might have learned about back in school. Thomas Malthus was a British economist and philosopher who lived at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Malthus is most famous for predicting that we were all going to starve to death. You see, Malthus lived at a time when he observed an exponential uplift in the population without corresponding growth in the resources available to those people. So he plotted it out on the chart that you see here on screen and quite reasonably concluded that based on the data, there wasn't going to be enough food and everyone would starve to death. Now, the fact that you and I are here sharing this moment together, some of us with ample waistlines, is proof that Malthus was wrong. But why? What did he miss? The data and the logic seem sound. Malthus failed to account for innovation in his model. You see, he lived at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, a time of unprecedented innovation in science, technology, industry, and agriculture. It was the era that led to the age of abundance that we enjoy today. And yet Malthus missed this happening right under his nose. But just because Malthus missed this and his model was wrong doesn't mean that it's completely useless. As W. Edwards Deming once said, all models are wrong, some are useful. So let's take Malthus's model and retrofit it to our shortage of software developers. So if we take the model and we substitute apps we need for population and developers we have for resources, I think we can all agree that we're well past the point of crisis where the lines intersect. Specifically, where we are past the point of crisis is irrelevant because the simple fact is we need far more apps than we have developers to create them. We basically have an app gap. However, in every crisis, there's an equal and opposite opportunity. And some clever people at Microsoft started looking into this, and they made some interesting conclusions. They realized that they have billions of users of Microsoft Excel worldwide. Now, you might be thinking, what does Excel have to do with application development? Well, as a Power Platform consultant, we're frequently brought in to replace the spreadsheet with Dataverse and Power Apps. And so Excel has been used as a pseudo-business application for many years. It can do some pretty advanced things. And so the team at Microsoft realized that with these billions of pseudo applications in Microsoft Excel, if creating apps worked just like Excel, we could potentially create billions of additional software developers, thereby solving our problem. And so if we come back to our model, to our app gap between apps we need and developers we have, and bring PowerFx into the mix, we start to close this app gap because we've dramatically increased the number of available software developers because creating business applications now works just like Excel. Looking at this from a slightly different camera angle, we have this idea of the democratization of technology. The idea that when technology first comes out, it's in the domain of the experts. And because it's in the domain of the experts, it takes a long time and costs a lot of money to get a little bit of it. And then over time, as we move from left to right through the graph, something changes. It moves from the experts to the users, and suddenly we get a lot more of it faster and cheaper than ever before. Basically, on the left-hand side of this graph, we have the app gap. And on the right-hand side, with PowerFx, we get app abundance. I believe that we're here. We're just past this inflection point where the lines intersect, and we're about to enter into an age of abundance of business applications because creating them is now as easy as using Microsoft Excel. And as a result, we've seen PowerFx explode across the Power Platform at a torrid pace. It's hard to believe that PowerFx is only 3 years old. It was first announced in November 2021 at the Ignite conference. And since then, it's grown incredibly. It started life in apps, moved to data, then to AI, automation, and web portals. That's an unbelievable growth trajectory in a very short period of time. So now that we understand the world into which PowerFx was born, we need to understand why. Why has this happened? What makes PowerFx so incredibly special? So let's take a look at the unique traits of PowerFx. As I go through these, I want you to keep this big idea in the back of your mind. PowerFx is designed for anyone to be able to pick it up, use it, and be productive with it fast. So with that said, let's explore the traits that make PowerFx incredibly. To start with, PowerFx is open source. Now you might be thinking, open source from Microsoft? Are you kidding? Those of you newer to the Microsoft ecosystem may not understand why this is such a big deal. Prior to Satya Nadella taking over as CEO a decade ago, Microsoft was an anything but open source type organization. In fact, their former CEO went so far as to refer to open source software as a form of cancer. And yet, in the decade since Nadella has been CEO, they've done a complete 180. Microsoft have embraced open source software, and the fact that PowerFx was released as open source is proof in just how far their thinking has changed in relation to open source software. You can go to GitHub today, where you can interact with the PowerFx source code. You can work with the development team at Microsoft and view the source code in GitHub. You can also interact with the wider community, people who are interested and involved in the development of PowerFx. This intersection of the team at Microsoft and the wider community via GitHub has some interesting advantages. To start with, we get faster development of new functions because the community can suggest things to the development team at Microsoft. We get faster bug fixes because, again, we have a wider community looking at issues that come up from time to time and thereby solving it quickly. And you can even fork the source code and create your own functions, submitting them for approval by the development team at Microsoft, or if you have some esoteric use case, creating a function to be used in your own environment. Basically, PowerFx benefits from what Linus Torvald, the founder of Linux, once said, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. But the fact that PowerFx is open source alone doesn't explain its tremendous growth trajectory. So the next thing we need to explore is that PowerFx is strongly typed. Now, if you're not a software developer, this might be a new concept for you. If you've ever worked in Canvas apps, you may be used to getting an error like this in the IntelliSense from time to time. What's going on is that because PowerFx is strongly typed, the guardrails and the training wheels have been built into it to address potential issues when you're developing so that you don't get them at runtime. This makes it easy for anyone to quickly understand what it's doing, learn it, and be productive with it. A classic example of this would be combining mismatched data types. Let's dive into that a little deeper and explore. Say we're trying to add two numbers together. We have two number ones. However, one is formatted as a string and one is formatted as a number. Now we expect 1 plus 1 to equal 2. However, depending on the application and the language it's developed in, we may get three separate results. If we're using a more weakly typed language, as long as our grammar and syntax is correct, we're going to be able to compile and run that code. And we won't realize that we have an issue until runtime, where we get a nasty error. Or something else might happen. We may not get an error, but the code will assume that because we have a text and a number, we don't want to add them. We just want to mash them together and concatenate them, giving us 11. That's still not great because we expect 1 plus 1 to equal 2. And that's why PowerFx gives you errors in the IntelliSense. When we try to put text and numbers together, it's going to say, I can't do that. Give me two numbers or give me two strings. That way I know what to do. So that's what we mean when we say PowerFx is strongly typed. Or as Shane Young of Power Apps 911 is fond of saying, Power Apps wants what it wants. The next thing that makes PowerFx unique is that it's declarative. Again, if you don't have a software development background, this may be a new concept to you. Software development languages tend to be imperative or declarative. Your imperative languages are traditional development languages like C# and .NET. And the way they work is that to get what you want, you must specify how to do it. So let's take the example of getting a cheeseburger. Say we want a Big Mac from McDonald's. If we were using an imperative language, we can't just ask for the Big Mac. We've got to tell it how to do it. 2 beef patties, special sauce and cheese, all on a sesame seed bun equals the Big Mac. We get what we want by specifying how to do it. Now, this gives us much more control over the way our program works, but it creates barriers to entry for makers and non-traditional devs. It can also lead to inconsistency between the way programs run. Declarative languages, such as PowerFx, work differently. We don't need to specify how to make the Big Mac. We simply roll up to the drive-thru and ask for it. I'd like the Big Mac, please. And so PowerFx is powerful because we simply tell it what we want. PowerFx figures out how to do that in the background behind the scenes. This makes it easier for everyone, from a maker trying this for the first time to a pro dev, to quickly understand what it's doing and be productive with it. Next, PowerFx is always live. Traditional software languages work a little differently than PowerFx. First, you need to write the code. Then you need to compile the code before you can actually run the code to see what it's doing. Not so with PowerFx. Like an Excel spreadsheet, you instantly see what your expression is doing, the same way Excel does it. This is what Microsoft mean when they say think Excel. You immediately see what your PowerFx expression does. This is important because it leads to shorter feedback loops, making it easy to learn PowerFx fast. Finally, PowerFx is one language to rule them all. When you're working with PowerFx, it actually compiles to different software languages on the back end. For example, if I'm creating something in Power Apps, it's creating JavaScript on the back end. I don't see that, and I don't care about that, because all I see is my app and my PowerFx expressions. But behind the scenes, that's what's actually happening. Or if I'm working in Dataverse with a formula column, it's actually compiling SQL Server code, stored procedures, and things like that behind the scenes. But again, we don't see it. We just work in PowerFx. Or if I'm working with Actions, say a low-code plugin, it's compiling C# behind the scenes. 3 very separate languages. Now, a full-stack dev might work across all 3 of these, but on large, complex projects, these are usually handled by 3 separate developers. And yet PowerFx lets us work across all 3, and it's smart enough to be context aware. So I use the same expressions and syntax in Power Apps, formula columns, low-code plugins, Power Pages, and PowerFx is smart enough to compile the required code on the back end. I don't have to worry about that. I just use the expressions I know and love in PowerFx. And so as a result, PowerFx has absolutely proliferated across the Power Platform. Starting life in Power Apps, began in Canvas apps. So if you've ever created a Canvas app, you've used PowerFx. It then came to the model-driven app by way of custom pages and modern commanding. And 2 years ago came to Dataverse by way of calculated columns. These are all GA features today. 18 months ago, we got low-code plugins and the command line interface. And then PowerFx came to Power Automate Desktop, Power Pages, and Copilot Studio. Just like Wonder Bread in the 1930s, PowerFx has grown significantly in just 3 years. And so this brings us to our demo. Let's get hands-on with PowerFx and see it working across the Power Platform, from modern commanding to formula columns in Dataverse to low-code plugins, Copilot Studio, Power Pages, and the command line interface. So let's pop over to the Power Platform. Okay, let's start with modern commanding. In my contact, in the ribbon here, you can see that I've got a Sales Easy button. This is a modern command that I created. It's predicated on the idea that salespeople need to do some research on a new prospect. Say I need to search Google and LinkedIn, and then I need to update the record to say that I've done my research, and I need to create an opportunity related to it. And once I've done my research, I want the button to go away so that I don't accidentally create another one. That's what the Sales Easy button is doing. Let's pop over to the Maker portal, and I'll show you what's happening behind the scenes with PowerFx. So this is my modern command here, and these are my PowerFx expressions. I've got a couple of launch expressions that are taking the name of the contact on the record in Dataverse and adding it to the search URLs in LinkedIn and Google. Then I'm updating my record to say that I've done the research and created an opportunity, creating the opportunity related to the record, and giving the user a notification, because feedback is the hallmark of good system design. And if I switch over to the visibility, once the sales research complete is equal to yes, the button disappears, so the person doesn't inadvertently create an extra opportunity. So let's come back to the model-driven app and see this in action. When I click the button, it's going to pop open Google and LinkedIn, and you can see that we've got a notification here in the model-driven app. This will disappear shortly. You can see that it's searched LinkedIn and it's searched Google, all with the click of a button. When I come back to my contact, you can see that the button has disappeared from the ribbon. The record has been updated to say that the research is complete, and my opportunity is created. If I switch these back to no from yes and save, my button comes back. So that's modern commanding using PowerFx. It's incredibly powerful. Let's move on to formula columns in Dataverse. Formula columns bring the PowerFx function library to the idea of calculated columns in Dataverse, making it incredibly useful. In the Maker portal, when you want to create a formula column, when you create a new column, you've got an option for PowerFx. And when you do, you get this formula canvas here where we can create our PowerFx expression. There's even a setting in the PPAC to get a Copilot to do this for you. This is a column that I created for an app I wrote a couple years ago to predict match winners at the Rugby World Cup. And what it does is it takes sentiment scores coming from Azure and compares them to predict the winning team. And so this PowerFx expression is comparing those sentiment scores and putting the prediction on the record in Dataverse. And so the first part of the expression says, if the sentiment score is not equal to 0 for both teams, but the score is equal, say it's 1-1, say the match is too close to call. Otherwise, if both is equal to 0, assume we haven't run the prediction yet and say we're predicting the winner. Otherwise, put the name of the team with the higher sentiment score. Now, what's powerful here is I'm actually grabbing the column value from a related record, from a many-to-one relationship. That makes this an incredibly useful feature. So let's pop into our model-driven app and see this in action. And so this is my column here, and it's based off of these two columns here. So you can see because the value is 0, it says we're predicting a winner. Let's update both of these to 1 and save. And it now says the match is too close to call. Let's update this home team to 2 and save. And it now predicts that New Zealand is going to win. If we come back here, we can see it's pulling this from the related record. Come back here, let's update the away team to 3 and save. And it now predicts that South Africa will win. Again, it's pulling from this related record. And so that's calculated columns in Dataverse. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when Microsoft say think Excel, they mean it. These columns change dynamically based on their inputs. So you do need to be careful. If you need to audit data or see a history of change, you won't get that. But for all other use cases, this is a marvelous feature. All right, let's move on to low-code plugins and actions in Dataverse. Low-code plugins hit the scene 18 months ago. And for the first time, makers and functionals are able to create synchronous real-time automation in Dataverse without getting pro devs involved. Prior to low-code plugins, this was the domain of pro devs and .NET. But now with low-code plugins, we can use PowerFx to create these for ourselves. This is an instant plugin that I created, which is actually a custom API in the background. And because it's a custom API, I can call it across the Power Platform. So I can create this PowerFx expression once and call it everywhere from Canvas apps to Copilot Studio to Power Automate and Dataverse. I've created this plugin to calculate the number of working days between two dates. This is something that frequently comes up in project land, and it's nice to be able to create this automation once and reuse it. And so my plugin is going to take some inputs. It's going to take the start and end dates because that's what we need to work out the number of working days. And then it's going to take a country and a county code. And it does that because low-code plugins can call APIs through the connectors in the Power Platform Maker portal. This makes them endlessly extensible in terms of the data they can bring in or write to. And once I've taken these parameters, I'm going to get my number of working days. So let's walk through how this works. When the plugin's triggered, the first thing I need to do is dynamically create a range of dates based on my start and end dates. After that, I need to get the public holidays for each year that's in that range of dates. You heard that correctly, years plural. Say, for example, we're calculating across the December to January New Year's period. We may have public holidays in 2024 and 2025 that we need to take into account. And so that's what we're doing here, is grabbing each year in the date range and grabbing the public holidays for each year in the range of dates. Once we've got our data, now we can start to crunch it and get our number of working days. The first thing we need to do with our range of dates is get all the weekdays. And so we're doing that here, grabbing our weekdays. The other thing we need to do with our public holidays is see if there are any public holidays in our range of dates. So we're looking for holidays that apply to anyone in the country that we've specified, as well as the locality code. For example, here in Auckland, we have a public holiday in January that only applies to us. Once we've got our weekdays and our number of holidays, it's simple subtraction. Subtract the holidays from the weekdays, and we get our number of working days. So let's see this in action. I'm going to calculate the number of working days between the 18th of December 2024 and the 17th of January 2025 for New Zealand and Auckland. So let's go ahead and run this plugin. And once it's finished running, we're going to see that there are 19 working days between these two dates in Auckland. There, it's run. We've got 19 working days. I won't pull the calendar out and count through it, but if you do pull up a calendar, you can see that in Auckland, there are in fact 19 working days. So that's Dataverse Actions low-code plugins using PowerFx. This is still preview, but watch this space. It's an incredibly useful feature. Let's move on to Copilot Studio. PowerFx in Copilot Studio allows us to work with our data and craft unique experiences for the user that give it individuality and flair. And so this is an action I've created in Copilot Studio to talk to the MSN weather connector. And when I ask it a question, do I need to wear a sweater? It's going to use the data coming back from that connector to answer me. And so I've got my answer here, and then I use PowerFx to let me know if I need to use a sweater. So I'm using an if expression to say, if the daily temperature is higher than 18 degrees Celsius, that's about 64 Fahrenheit, I won't need a sweater, otherwise I will. Now, one thing to point out is that when you're using PowerFx in a Copilot response, you don't format the entire response as a PowerFx expression. You simply stick the expression in between the other parts of the response. So think email template. And so this is the response here. So let's see this in action. Let's say, do I need to wear a sweater? It's going to ask me for my location, eventually. Let's say Auckland. And it's going to say that the temperature in Auckland is 17 degrees Celsius today, so we're going to need a sweater. Let's try it for another city. Do I need to wear a sweater? And this time, let's specify Honolulu. It's pretty warm and sunny there. And it's going to be balmy in Honolulu today, 29 degrees Celsius. That's the low 80s Fahrenheit. We're not going to need a sweater in Honolulu today. So that's an example of PowerFx running in Copilot Studio to give your users some individuality and flair. Moving on, let's go to the new kid on the block and Power Pages. PowerFx in Power Pages is one of the most exciting developments for me because Power Pages is simultaneously one of the most low-code parts of the Power Platform where we can literally create a web portal that talks to Dataverse with the click of a button that ultimately becomes one of the most pro-code parts of the Power Platform due to the customizations that clients often want. And so PowerFx coming to Power Pages means that this starts to become more of a low-code experience. And so let's look at 3 examples of PowerFx in Power Pages. When we add the row, this is going to increase from 21 to 22. Our fizz will change to buzz, and this picture of Auckland will change to a gorgeous landscape picture of the New Zealand countryside. So let's go ahead and add this, and we'll click home. And you can see that we've got 22 test pages. That's an even number. Our fizz has changed to buzz on the label, and the image has changed to this gorgeous picture of the New Zealand landscape. Let's add one more to change it back, and we'll click home. And you can see we've now got an odd number of Power Pages test tables. Buzz has reverted to fizz, and we're back to our gorgeous image of Auckland at night. So it's early days, but it's exciting to see what we can do with PowerFx in Power Pages. Now, in the real world, you would likely use this to interact with the logged in user and give them a customized experience based on attributes on their record in Dataverse, perhaps their membership status, their location, their age, something like that. All right, last thing I'm going to show you is PowerFx working in the command line interface. And so we need to pop over to VS Code. Now we can do some incredibly cool stuff in the Power Platform command line interface. We can interact directly with Dataverse and really do some unique things. The first thing I'm going to show you is my random name generator. This is an interpolated string that's using a couple tables I've created in Dataverse, first name and last name. I've seeded these tables with the 500 most common first and surnames on planet Earth. And then what I'm doing for each of these is I'm running a shuffle function. Think shuffling a deck of cards. Once it does that, I just grab the first record after the shuffle. So it's getting a random first and last name. This makes life easy when you need to create test data and test users. I always struggle to come up with names. So let's see this in action. And it's given us a random name. Let's try this one more time. So pretty cool, we can get random names. We can also get counts of tables. So we're going to count the rows in our first name table. Let's do that. You can see we've got 500. We can even do searches. We can look for a user whose last name is, or a last name of Smith, and it's found it. Now we can start to interact with Dataverse in other ways. We can create a record. So we've got a test table, and we're going to create a test table with the name being test table and a count of rows in that table. So let's go ahead and run that. This is going to run, and we've created test table 205. Let's pop into the model-driven app and verify that. We come to test tables, and indeed, it's been created. The last thing I'm going to show you is the ability to update contacts in Dataverse. So we can use patch to update a contact. We're going to look for a contact whose last name is Rose, and we're going to change the surname to Awesome Rose because it's the Roses time. So let's go ahead and run that and make the Roses awesome. All right, that's run. Let's come back to our model-driven app, and you can see indeed we've updated the record. So that's the command line interface with PowerFx. So we've seen modern commanding, Dataverse formula columns, Dataverse actions, Copilot Studio, Power Pages, and the command line interface. These are all places where you can use PowerFx low code across the Power Platform today to do some incredibly powerful things. And because we were using PowerFx, we didn't have a flaming disaster. But what does this mean for you? As a maker, you're now empowered to solve business challenges. You no longer have to get pro devs involved for all apps and automations you need. You can solve simple business challenges yourself. This makes you more productive. Similarly, for functionals, for business analysts, we can create apps and automations ourselves. We don't need to get pro devs involved for everything. However, when we are doing this, we need to understand when it's appropriate to leverage low code, such as PowerFx, and when we shouldn't, and when we should be using pro code. And finally, for the pro devs, you now have a choice. You can go low code with PowerFx or pro code, and because the BAs, the functionals, and the makers are freed up to create apps and automations for themselves, you've got time to focus on complex challenges that require pro code. And so this brings us to the end of our time together. We've seen that just like Wonder Bread in the 1930s, PowerFx is suddenly in everything, everywhere, and all at once across the Power Platform. And this is because it solves our app gap. It lets anyone who knows how to use Excel create apps and automations in the Power Platform, which means we have more developers to create the applications we need. Everyone from pro devs to makers benefits from PowerFx, and it leads the way to an app-abundant future. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I can't wait to hear your questions. I love the questions that you ask. I get my best insights and ideas from them. A huge thank you to the team at DynamicsCon for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed being involved in this event, and I look forward to seeing everyone else's presentation. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are tuning in from. Thanks so much for coming along to my session, and I'm happy to take some questions. It's been some great questions in the chat, just scrolling through this. Sean, how much of the bread market Wonder Bread had before sliced bread? That is a great question. I'm definitely going to be ChatGPTing this later on today. Shane Young, definitely the OG in the PowerFX space. Love that guy. I've learned so much from him. Custom libraries. So you can create named expressions in Canvas apps, and you can fork the source code to create your own expressions in PowerFX and either submit them to the dev team for approval or use them in your own environment. It's not something that I've tried yet. It's on my list of things that I'm keen to try in the near future. And then in terms of Copilot Studio, so your mileage will vary with your prompts. You can be somewhat imprecise, but as I'm sure many of you have experienced, it can vary in terms of whether Copilot's going to interpret what you're asking for correctly. Let's see, Sean, definitely a badge of honor to contribute to the PowerFX library. Definitely something I'm keen to do. Estimate for when low-code plugins will be GA. Microsoft can afford much better lawyers than I can, but keep your eyes peeled in the very near future. And yeah, hang on, let me grab my LinkedIn. I'll post that to the chat. There you go. So yeah, definitely throw me a connect on LinkedIn. Love interacting with everyone. ProCode is an example of this Azure Functions. Sorry, can you clarify a bit what you mean by an example being Azure Functions? Just give me a bit of context. I guess without the context, yeah, you could use Azure Functions in a ProCode scenario. So if you didn't want to use a low-code plugin, if you needed some real-time automation or something like that. Favorite type of bread? Oh, that's a very good question. That's a hard one to answer. I guess I'm a huge fan of challah bread that you can get from some of the good delis back in my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland. Hang on, clarification. PowerFX is like Azure Functions for all Power Platform tools. That's a good question. I'd say it's probably more like C# or JavaScript for Power Platform tools because it lets you do a number of different things depending on your context. So my understanding is that Azure Functions are more kind of like a plugin or the doing, whereas PowerFX lets you customize everything from UI to data to process. So I would understand it more as kind of C#, JavaScript, that type of thing. What are my biggest PowerFX projects? So PowerFX is still mostly in preview. So you can use it Canvas apps and a little bit in Dataverse and GA. So I've predominantly used it in my side projects and my demos that I've built. I was able to recently use formula columns for something that we needed in our internal CRM at Olympic, and it was pretty cool to be able to do that. One of the limitations that we do have with it is they don't support currency columns. So if you've got a currency column that you want to use in your PowerFX formula, you've got to use a value expression to convert that to an integer. What else? Biggest challenges getting started with PowerFX. I'd say the biggest thing is getting your head around how the formulas work in terms of where PowerFX really shines and gets powerful is when you're combining a bunch of formulas together and nesting them to take data that you have and turn it into something that you want. And so getting your head around that model. And so the easiest way to think about it is data I have, and then expand out to data I want to nest the functions that way. It works the opposite way if you're using with, which is another important one to get your head around. So it lets you do stuff and then variabilize that to do other stuff. Great questions, guys. Really love it. And yeah, let me offline, I'll definitely put some more thought and attention into this so that I can answer you more completely. Official roadmap for PowerFx features and commands. So the best place, there is a roadmap that that Microsoft have for the Power Platform. There's an official one called Microsoft Planner that you can follow. The other thing I would do is just get in the Microsoft Docs. There is new stuff coming all the time. So either in terms of where they're bringing PowerFX. So for example, at Build, we just got it in Power Pages, or just new functions and expressions that are coming to the PowerFX library and things that are in preview. So yeah, I would say spend time in the Microsoft Docs. Also, get involved with the GitHub. The full repo is on GitHub. You can interact with the dev team. I've not done a lot of it, but I will say earlier this year, so as you saw in the demo, the plugin to calculate working days, that was actually a product of a collab between James Williams and myself. James is a community member in the UK, and we linked up over an issue that I had posted on GitHub. And so GitHub's a great place to just see what's going on in the PowerFX world. Preferred resource for finding PowerFX expressions with the correct syntax. Definitely go for the Microsoft Docs. Also, Matthew Devaney's blog, he has some fantastic resources on how to use the expressions. Sometimes the docs don't always give you the best examples. Matthew Devaney's blog is outstanding, and he's got some really good ways that he's broken down the expressions. Missed the links. I'll share those out on LinkedIn. Thanks so much. I'm glad you enjoyed the session. Really appreciate that. Remember an issue with choice columns. Is that a case, or are we having a nightmare? No, that is, choice columns are definitely challenging when you're working in PowerFX. In formula columns, you've got to type the name of the column and then hit dot and the name of the column and then the choice option from memory. One shortcut that I found was I actually used a Canvas app to type out what I wanted with the choice, and then I copy pasted it into the command line interface, and it just worked. So that could be a good workaround. Have you seen PowerFX horribly misused? Wow. That is a great question. I love that. Can I think about that and maybe post something to socials? Yeah, 'cause nothing comes to mind immediately, and that's not to say that it hasn't been. I need some time to kind of digest and think through that. Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you found my YouTube channel. I do have a bit of content on there. I need to develop some more, but yeah, I do try to keep that up to date with in-depth tutorials. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming along. Really enjoyed interacting with you all. Definitely ping me here in the Brella app. I'll join the breakout room for a bit. Drop me a connect on LinkedIn, and yeah, thank you all so much. Really enjoyed it. Love the questions, and let me think about how I've seen PowerFX horribly misused, and I'm definitely going to do a post on that in the near future. Yeah. Any remaining questions? Oh, you guys are awesome for coming along. I usually end these by saying, go do something awesome on the Power Platform today. So yeah, let's all go do something awesome on the Power Platform today. After DynamicsCon virtual, obviously. So yeah. My first PowerFX use case. Great question. I first used it in Canvas apps and custom pages back in 2021, and I was very new to it. And then in 2022, I started getting hands-on with modern commanding and model-driven apps, and that's where I really started diving deep into the PowerFX world. And so really did quite a lot with modern commands, and it's been really cool to see that grow and expand. A number of my colleagues have used them in projects, and so it's been really cool Another thing, just to answer one of the earlier questions about some of the bigger stuff that I've seen with PowerFx. So I wasn't hands-on with this, but one of my colleagues used a custom page to do some pretty innovative stuff with email templating. So that's something that I've seen that you can definitely dive into. Yeah, fantastic questions, everyone. I've really, really appreciated you coming along to this. And thank you to DynamicsCon Virtual for putting this on and all the event sponsors. It's been awesome to come and share my passion for PowerFx with the community. So thanks to everyone for coming along and all the organizers for putting this on.